Welcome everybody to the first Antalis Creative Power webinar. We are really happy to have two great guests today, Emilios Theofanous from Monotype and Anastasios Margenis from the Greenwich University. The topic today is type and design for good, and I will leave the speech to Anastasios to start.
Thank you, Jérôme. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you here today. So I'm going to start sharing my screen, so that will help me to go through the things I would like to discuss with you today. So give me 1 second. Okay, Jérôme, my screen, great, fantastic. So when I got the invitation from you guys to talk to you about design and typography for good, thinking about my background coming from an inclusive design, I'm thinking that there are ways to engage people, and I know that Emilios later will focus more on the type aspect, on the typography aspect of this. So I'm gonna give you some kind of overview, first of all, of the work I'm doing as a professor of inclusive design and head of School of Design at the University of Greenwich in London. And I will talk to you a bit about design processes, how we can design with and we design for the others. So starting, what more common subject than the pandemic? So the pandemic is a measure of change in inclusive design and change the way we see things, change the way we design, change the way we exist in the society. So, and in particularly, it changed not only the way we exist and we design, but also changed time. Time is now irrelevant during a pandemic. Aristotle, the Greek philosopher, he mentioned that while time is a measure of change, it does not exist only on its own as a container to put things into. Rather, it depends on what is shifting, reshaping, and what remaining the same. So therefore, the pandemic introduced a new time that could shape the role of the post-pandemic designer. For those that don't know, this is the School of Athens from the Renaissance Italian school. So I'm using this image here because I want to see that we've been in a society where we had no fear to be across others, we had no fear to engage people, and we learn how to design with other people together. So the pandemic in a way changed this approach and asked us to think how we're designing from distance, how we use new tools, and how we develop new ideas and more inclusive ideas about design processes. So an example, the product design here, protecting us from the disease. This is the bathrooms designed for previous years during pandemics, during, for example, the 1918 influenza. That is the technology and the products we had at the time, and this is what we have today. So designers based on different times, as Aristotle mentioned, they're trying to find solutions to address issues. And that's perhaps here is a new hospital that we haven't really thought about this perhaps 100 years ago. So with this massive and unexpected rise of the pandemic since early last year, actually, or early this year, which with the new variations, designers everywhere have been hanging on the research and outputs of the scientific communities, especially the epidemiologists, and building on healthy best practice today. But the sheer volume of research and data and the professional responsibility we bear can be overwhelming. And therefore, since the beginning of the century, time has taught us that while addressing any human disease, it is important that our behaviors can also help minimize the impact of any disease, both communicable, like the pandemics, and non-communicable, like diabetes, heart disease, and other chronic issues. So recent research in health-related disciplines is now informing how we, as designers, encourage people to change their habits from reading to getting fit, to social interaction, how we as designers, we shape our shapes indoors and outdoors to encourage interaction with others, to encourage movement, flexibility, choice, and generally improve mental and physical health. I know that later Emilios will give you some examples based on how we change in habits of reading and how the digital type can change the way we appreciate and appreciate text. Talking about inclusive design overall, the first thing that comes to our head perhaps is disabilities. And disabilities, they are visible. However, there are hidden disabilities or mental disabilities that us as designers, we're not always taking into account in the design process. So I selected a number of different examples to show you in order to understand more or less how good design can in a way engage people, and then how the design process can engage people, can co-design with designers and end users a good product. So this is an airport design I'm going to show you that restores in a way the passenger's confidence. Designers need to redesign airport experience, for example, after the pandemic, in order to address how we're communicating and how we inclusive spatial accessibility. So traveling massively changed. Designers changed the way they design for travel. We are now thinking about limited space on airports. We are thinking that our digital technologies can help us through the trip, and then we're thinking less about the previous experiences we had. Therefore, designers, they need to understand the new passenger. They need to understand who are these people that they're traveling, how they're traveling, how we can communicate with them. However, in the same way, we need to think about inclusive spaces. We need to consider readability and good design communication to better inform the end user. And then, as you have seen, we introduced new languages. In the last couple of years, because of the pandemic, we introduced new toolkits, new graphic language to encourage social distancing. And this is a very good example here, where you can see how this new language or existing language is adjusted to address a current problem. And that reminds me a bit of hieroglyphics, maybe, or from the Egyptian maybe times, etc., where we still are not able, some of those, like the Festus disc, we are not still able to read. However, those kind of new messages, new images, they're giving us new opportunities and also addressing a lot of issues regarding inclusive readability. We introduce new language. So now we are telling people to stay apart, just to protect themselves. So we have applied these new rules to our everyday lives. We have introduced new design to support visibility issues. We have this, for example, here, a 3D map where it's exploring spaces for people with visual impairments. So the design process helped in a way to address some issues that we haven't addressed before. However, the COVID era also it gave an opportunity to brands to embrace more human-centric visual identities. A very good example here is the Burger King, of how it was before, how it became after the co-design process that happened for the design brand. So the pandemic, as a measure of change, gave us the opportunity to rethink how we used to design before and how now we can use to address the issues that we're facing. So accessible design for all in the post-COVID workplace is now considered. We're designing more with and for others, for wider and more meaningful impact. We started developing collaborations, remote collaborations. We start thinking about how we can engage more people from diverse parts of the world, with different expertise. So we have been using more online tools that we can talk to people. We have reduced the travel we have, which means that we're protecting the environment. Perhaps we're responding to some of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, etc. And we have learned how to coexist together on a digital space. So technology is changing our habits. So designing for the individual and not for the mass production is now more current and more important than ever perhaps before. We have developed technology that actually inclusive design addressing psychological safety. This is a very good example here of how this particular product can help you exist in your local environment when you are spending more time at home, and it is associated with your everyday activities. So we have developed also understanding about people that surrounding us. So this is a very good exhibition happened in the Prado in Madrid, where for the first time people with disabilities can feel the paintings, something that doesn't really happen often in a museum. So we are engaging more with the society, we are impacting more people, and this is extremely important as designers to engage these people in this process. Design is changing and time is going very fast. We have to take a deep breath, maybe do some yoga, slowly count down to 10, start again, and something new will change the way we design. And this perhaps should be the way we as designers need to think a bit more about inclusive approaches. The design in a pandemic and changed the way that some brands exist. So, and I know that some of the brands, Emilios will talk to you about that later. So design brands like luxurious brand vanished overnight, which make us rethink who we are and how we exist in society and what's our priorities. The image here is from some workers in India, which is one of the largest producers of luxury brand infrastructure. They have the largest infrastructure for luxury brands, where a lot of our colleagues in those design disciplines, in one night, they lost their job. Therefore, what is happening is we are introducing, based on this kind of approach of the pandemic or changing the way that we're becoming more inclusive, we're changing policies to protect our disciplines. So the European Union, for example, it came up in early last year with a new creative economy on how to support design disciplines, creative industries within with a new policy. So that means that we are adjusting, and that is the overall thinking here, that every time there's a difficulty as designers, we are the first that we are adjusting in order to respond creatively, more to be more diverse, but also to be more inclusive. The next pandemic is a matter of when, not if. No matter how well prepared we are, no matter how many design tools or design methods we invent in order to engage people, then it is not about when it's going to happen or if it's going to happen, but we need to be aware that we will face similar situations. And this is what the work we do here at the University of Greenwich, the Diversity and Inclusivity by Design Research Lab is exploring, is a collaborative research initiative which embeds diversity and inclusion research in creative spaces, especially in the areas of art and design, through co-design methodologies. The research we do here in the lab is informing to shape diversity and inclusion policy. We have been working with governmental and non-governmental organizations in order to transform people's life. Currently working on projects with Northwest Europe, where we are trying to support vulnerable young people to increase skills and confidence through design methods, through co-design methods, and then to engage more and create more meaningful impact. So good design teaching us how to adjust, how to be diverse, how to be inclusive, and innovation going beyond of the usual methods. Out of the bubonic plague came the Renaissance. Out of the COVID, what? Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Anastasios. I invite our attendees to type their question in the chat, or to wait until the end of this webinar to do a live Q&A also with you. And I think it's your turn, Emilios, to focus on type.
I'm here. Let's see if this will work now. We had some issues earlier with sharing the screen, but I will give it a go, and we'll see how it goes. So let me share this and have this here. So let me go back. So is everything okay, Jérôme? Can you see the screen?
You can see your screen.
Okay, thank you. So hello everyone, and thanks so much for joining. So my name is Emilios Theofanous, and I'm a type director here at the Monotype studio in London. So design and type for good is such a broad and interesting title, and Anastasios touched on so many nice things just right now. So I thought it would be a bit more beneficial to be quite specific and practical. And so today we can talk a bit about type accessibility for text settings and how we can make informed decisions for more accessible and legible designs. So when it comes to type accessibility, the answer is two-part. Firstly, how we choose type, and secondly, how we use type. So let's start with choosing type and a few things to keep in mind for more accessible typography. There is no magic recipe here, but a few tips and tricks that in combination with correct type usage, as we will see in a bit, will help improve any project. So current palette of choices is practically endless. As I'm sure you're aware, there are so many typefaces to choose from, and the Monotype library alone has thousands of fonts. But one should not be afraid of this expedition, sort of to say. If anything, it can be quite rewarding at the end. So of course, when in doubt, we can always start with the basics. So let's have a look. So when choosing type, our first choice is often between serifs and sans, and the 21st century font usage, mostly in the digital environments we daily interact with, tells us that sans is more legible than serif, but this preference is quite conditioned. So it all depends on what we are looking at. And while the majority of books in print are set in serif fonts, the serifs are very scarce on small screens. So suffice to say, we've grown accustomed to reading sans on screens. So it really depends on the medium of choice for a project. The X height is also a very important choice you have to make, because large X heights are generally more legible because they make the type appear larger. In this example, we can see the optical size axis in Helvetica now variable, traveling from display to micro, and along other optical corrections, we can see that the X height of the typeface is also increasing. So to illustrate, the X height does leave an impression on type. So both of these text blocks are in the same point size, but the one on the right appears considerably larger because of its X height. So I'm sure you might have been in similar situations when you set two typefaces of the same point size, but their size appears to be different, and this is usually because of the X height. And among other design details, X height is also something you should keep into consideration when pairing typefaces. So when you're looking, for example, for a sans companion to a serif or vice versa. Aperture is also a good question to ask. So do our letter forms have open or closed apertures? And for you who are not aware of the typographic term, apertures are the openings of letters where the exterior space mixes with the interior space of the character. So for example, here we can see in the line below that open apertures can promote a horizontal flow and help disambiguate characters in comparison with the line on top, which everything looks more closed. They are also considerably more legible than closed apertures. So the one on the right again appears more legible. So we have to keep this in mind when choosing typefaces for specific usage. Let's say, for example, when type is used in interfaces that require an ambiguous input, such as passwords. Choosing type with unique letter shapes also helps legibility, making type more accessible. So this is perhaps extreme example, but are the character shapes quite unique? Do the G and the 9 look alike? Is the uppercase I and the lowercase l and the number 1 similar, or are they distinct enough? I'm not sure how how often this happens, right? One would write ib.11, but ambiguous letter shapes can be easily misread. So this ambiguation is important. Talking about spacing, we should ask, is there enough space between letters and words? Usually ample spacing aids in differentiating one letter from another and ensures that words remain distinct elements. So tight spacing, as one can predict, is less legible. Eurostyle on the left feels quite cramped, while Frutiger on the right has a more smooth and legible rhythm. And of course, it's important to understand the intended usage of the typeface. So for example, the one on the left, Eurostyle, it's a display typeface designed to shine at larger sizes. So choosing type for the intended point size we set text in is equally as important. Next question will be, what weight are our letter fonts? So as one can imagine, standard weights like the one on the right here, or what we call a regular or a book weight, they hold up way better in reduction than the thin weights, which they tend to break and appear fractured when set in small sizes for body copy. Similarly, with bold to black weights, when we set to start long bodies of text, they appear to lose definition as we go in smaller sizes. As with weight, we have to ask what width are our letter fonts. Again, standard widths, as one can predict, they make better use of unique letter shapes and than condensed or compressed widths. Like we can see in this example here on the left, we have something that is very condensed, while on the right, we have something that is more open. It has a more comfortable flow of text. But of course, again, all this depends on the project and the content. So for example, often financial institutions with lots of printed contracts with small legal copy will prefer a slightly more condensed width, which in the long run can save lots of paper. So the font choice can also provide a more economical body length and provide some sustainability outreach for the company. So we always have to find a balance between accessibility and typography with sustainable sensibilities for efficient designs. Italics or uprights? Well, while italics are rarely used today for anything more than emphasis, for example, it's worth noting that they are less familiar to readers and therefore less legible than Romance or upright letters. If we go back in time, let's say 15th or 16th century, these italics were the preferred style of the era. So whole books were printed in italic type, which in serif fonts is usually much more economical, saving paper and also making the books cheaper for the time. So nowadays, we don't use them as often for long text, so we are less accustomed to reading them. When it comes to case, uppercase letters appear significantly larger than upper and lowercase or just plain lowercase. For small amount of text, they can be very effective. So I'm sure you might have said a headline or a quote in uppercase. But when it comes to whole bodies of text, the similarity of widths and the shapes that appear in uppercase, they make them less legible. So that was choosing type, and some of those parameters are things that we as type designers can control, for example, in the design of the typeface. But most of these things are things that are directly under the control of graphic designer by making sound typographic decisions. So the way we use type and the choices we make after we've chosen type are arguably more important. And of course, bear in mind that accessible typography should not hinder your creativity. So by far, the most important choice when using type is the size of the type. As a rule of thumb, use type sizes that are legible for your intended audience. So one should ask, for example, how large is the type I'm setting text in? Is it microtype, equivalent to 6 or 8 point in print? Is it more of a text type, like 9 to 14, or is it more of a display size for larger point sizes? So each of these ranges have its own unique requirements. true microtype, as we can see here in Helvetica now variable, has usually wider spacing, a larger X height, less contrast, and more open forms than text or display variants. So these are the things we already discussed before. And similarly, if we see on the other hand, display fonts, they have to be ready for attention or a nice close-up. For example, we see them like in magazines or headlines in newspapers. So they have to be more refined, have a tighter spacing. And we can see here in this example is Comfort variable by Monotype Creative Director Tom Foley, as it moves across the optical size. So to illustrate, here we are in the text size and here we are in the display size. So you can see as the changes go along in the design decisions were made for the typeface. We all know that color is an effective communication tool. We see it every day, you know. We see in color, thank God. So using color and type is doubly effective. And of course, provided that text and background are working together. So low contrast between type and background can restrain legibility. And similarly, high contrast or vibrating color combinations, they present obvious challenges. And certain color combinations like this one, they are challenging, if not invisible, to those living with color blindness. So statistically, a few people now in this webinar might not be able to see at all what's happening on the screen or see something with very low contrast. So about 112 men and 200 women have issues with color blindness. So polarity, when using type and contrast taken to the extreme, so this has an effect on legibility, and black on white usually performs way better in legibility tests than white on black. So in the legibility test we did with MIT, black on white text was comprehended a whopping 38% faster than white on black. So to illustrate, this is much more legible, significantly than so this, for example. But nowadays, we are also getting used to reading in dark mode or night mode on our phones. So we are reading white text or black. So perhaps future studies will capture this, this change as we become more and more accustomed to reading white and black. So leading, when we are setting type, the space between the lines of types, it can also impact legibility. Whether it's the comfort of extra space between lines or the feeling of crampedness, impressions do impact legibility, and leading leaves an impression. So for example, here to illustrate, the left block is less inviting than the one on the right. Of course, you can read both of them, and but the one on the right is much more legible and comfortable to the eyes. And finally, the length of the line or the measure, which can contribute or detract from the legibility of the type. If the lines are too long, they can be fatiguing and lead to readers doubling or mistakenly reading the same line of type 2 or more times. If the lines are too short, the content looks fragmented, broken into too many pieces for solid comprehension. So analyze the text you're setting and choose a typeface appropriate for the content and medium you're using. So for example, phone screens have so much horizontal space. So don't use a very wide font that will break every few words. Use line lengths that can promote comprehension. So this is a recap, and feel free to take a screenshot. So when you are choosing type, the 9 ingredients for legible and accessible typography are a serif or a sans serif choice that fits the reader's expectations for the reading environment you're in. A reasonable X height, remembering that the X height can convey the impression of size at type. Open apertures are more legible in text contents than closed apertures. Choose type with unambiguous forms. Opt for generous spacing, though not so wide as to inhibit comprehension. Choose a weight that is neither too heavy or too light, and choose a width that is neither too wide or too condensed. Romans or uprights instead of italics, and use of lowercase or upper and lowercase instead of all caps when setting long paragraphs of text. And when we are using type, the 6 key ingredients for legible and accessible typography are large enough type for the content, the audience, and the reading environment we're in. A color that does not inhibit readability, discernible by the audience, and suited to the reading environment we are. Keep sufficient contrast with the background. With polarity, choose black type on a white background as it performs better, and keep sufficient leading to avoid doubling, to promote comprehension and to avoid crowding. And finally, choose a measure of length, of line length that promotes comprehension by also being sympathetic to the text. So now I would also like to briefly talk about some recent projects from the Monotype Studio that take into consideration some of the accessibility principles we just talked about, but also touch on inclusion and diversity subjects that Anastasios already talked about. So as I mentioned earlier, accessible typography should not hinder your creative process, and this is a prime example. So Mind is the UK's biggest mental health charity, and Design Studio in London asked us if we could help them make something ownable and distinctive. So Monotype Studio customized FS Meridian by reviewing areas of ambiguity in the letter shapes, adapting the proportions, opening the counter shapes, and making all of these small tweaks to improve the readability of the font. So you can see the top left image here, some of the principles we already talked about taking place for this project. And aside from increased accessibility, Mind Meridian also reflects a growing need for brands and organizations to adopt a more human, a more honest, and more authentic approach to design. So accessible typography can be part of the process and not be treated as an afterthought. This is another project, the recent one for M&M's, made with the JKR in London and New York. So the iconic brand got a modern makeover with a revamped purpose of creating a world where everyone feels like they belong. So with a fresh look and updated personalities for the famous M&M's characters, a more inclusive and welcoming tone of voice, and a brand new attention-grabbing typeface called All Together. So M&M's new typography truly reinforces the goal of the rebrand, which is we are all together and there is strength in our diversity. You may also have seen this launch in the past weeks or so. So Every is the new name and brand for Hermes, the UK's largest dedicated parcel delivery company. And Monotype Studio worked with SuperUnion to make a living and adaptive logotype powered by variable font technology for every parcel, every person, every place. So the design for this, it's in the name itself, it's every, for everyone and everything. And our creative response was to represent this diversity and inclusion in the design itself. So Every said they had a fleet of about 5,000 trucks and drivers that needed unique logotypes, as you know, each person is unique, each driver is unique. So it created a variable font with more than 190,000 194,000 unique logo possibilities. And this was quite a fun project to work on. It was really nice to get studios' ideas thrown in for all of these letter fonts. And lastly, the new identity for New York City Pride. So Monotype, a Lipping Code partner to create up a bold and inclusive new identity for New York City Pride. The goal of the rebrand was to create a feeling of inclusivity and capture the spirit and importance of the organization's home city. And for the identity, two typefaces with strong New York City roots were chosen to represent the brand. Gotham and Knockout, both from New York City-based Heffer & Co. Foundry, now part of the Monotype library. So that's it from me as well. Thank you so much for your time and attention. And yeah, let's have some Q&A if you have any questions.
Thanks a lot, Emilios. Yes, we do have question maybe. Before getting into very specific question from our audience, could you tell us both what brought you to being a type designer and you, Anastasios, focusing on design for inclusive design?
Emilios, I'm going to start so I can use some time to breathe from your presentation. I think that it's very interesting here, Jérôme, because from my perspective, I am looking the way design as an overall thing across different areas, where what Emilios showed us, it was more focused on typography, was very, very descriptive and very good. I mean, the approach was very nice and actually responding to what I was saying earlier. I think that there are two ways here. Either as a designers, we have to think how we design and engaging people in this design process. We need to consider people, as Emilio said, that might be colorblind, or the space of where we're displaying our design and what we want to get out of it. We need to think into account, we take into account the even weather conditions. For example, something that's displayed in California, it might not be the same as displaying in London based on the light or whatever on the surroundings, etc. So I think as designers, we need to be aware. And I know one of the questions that someone asked in the chat here is if there are specific fonts for dyslexia or neurodiversity, etc. There are plenty of, just to answer the question as well, there are plenty of fonts that can respond to some aspect of dyslexia or neurodiversity, but we have to be very specific. We have to say that this font is designed particularly for that group of people that they have XYZ needs. So this is the role of a designer for our society now in this 21st century. We need to be more aware and designing in order to address issues.
Thanks. So another question about accessibility. So how might we design type revivals, digitalization with consideration to accessibility? Or should we? Question from Jean-Luc.
I think, of course, so it's what Anastasios is just mirroring what he says, that usually when you have something, it's always part of a larger equation, of a larger, in a project, there are so many parameters one have to consider. So it's not always only the typeface, or not always just the paper, or where you present things, or what your target audience is. So you have to take all these things into account when you're designing. And I mean, of course, when it comes to revivals or digitization, so we can make something that speaks of a specific genre, but of course you can have all of these accessibility parameters I just talked about infused into the design. So revival doesn't mean it has to be, you know, identical or mirrored. It might be just inspired from a certain era, or has certain cultural sensitivities of the type one is using for. So yeah, I'm just trying to go through the question. Is there a specific trend in type these days? This is a very nice question, Naomi. We usually, sorry, let me find the link. We actually do have a trends report that every year is done from our creative type directors, Phil and Charles. So I will find the link and put it in the chat for everyone to go around, which is very interesting to see. I'm finding this now.
Emilios, I will step in until you find the link. There are some kind of questions that come into the chat that are talking about different disabilities, different inclusive approach design, if there's a specific font that we use for print or digital, or what is the trends at the moment, etc. So I just want to say what you just, in a way, to take what the comment you make about sustainability earlier. And I think that the trend at the moment is that we're trying to respond to current issues and problems that we're facing, sustainability, for example. And I was thinking about how, as designers, we're taking, let's say, the United Nations Sustainable Goals into our design process. And what does it mean? It means that we are designing to save the environment, let's say. Okay, how do we do that? Online collaboration, let's create a font, let's say, or reducing printing, because some of you mentioned in the chat that is the same font for print or digital. I think these kind of ideas and concepts, they change the way we design. And I think that this is perhaps how we are responding to current trends, by applying problems into the design and then find solutions.
Thanks. And maybe I would have myself have a question. Do you see various or different trends between type for print and type for digital? Are they going the same direction, or really rather opposite?
I think it depends. It usually again depends on project and the context, but it's also what the audience expect. Like I said earlier, usually if we are going on, let's say, publishing for books, one would expect like a more comfortable serif and for casual reading. But if we are reading on screens, like news, for example, we might expect a sans serif. So it all depends on the medium and the audience that you're touching for. So long story short, it would be, yes, there are quite trends that go in different paths, but there are also are the how do you say, trusted and tested typeface that can really get the content out without having too much of character themselves, for example. So it all depends to what you are looking to shout. I'm just trying to see the question.
Emilios, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Can I ask you a question, Emilios?
Of course.
So I perhaps that may be the question that others they would like to hear as well. I mean, specifically about type design and type designers. So what is the trend, going back to the trends, what is like the trend of hiring someone in type industry? So what knowledge is expected from someone that's joining a type foundry? And are those areas of diversity and inclusivity essential for someone as well to be hired?
So in terms of knowledge, it can be, you just have a good eye for type. It doesn't have to, you doesn't have to have finished 10 universities to be a type designer, for example. And what's interesting nowadays is that the type design tools have become more accessible and cheaper than what they were, for example, 10 years ago. So a lot of graphic designers play and experiment with, and they acquire the knowledge needed for type design or for smaller projects, let's say a lettering or a logotype or something like this. When it comes to cultural sensitivities as well, it's also important because, for example, I cannot draw the entire scripts of the world, there's so much brain in here. So it's usually good to, not good, this is usually the process. So when we're designing for a script we are not accustomed with, or the cultural sensitivities of the script, we talk with the designer that it's local, and they can approach the design with the heritage it deserves, for example. But I'm also, what I said, I wanted just to elaborate more. I'm really happy for what is happening in the design scene nowadays, with especially young people getting their hands on dirty, in a sense, and playing with type in ways that we've never seen before. Like, I mean, the people I follow on Instagram, online, a lot of experiments, which is really, really nice, because sometimes working in experimental ways can push the whole field further, and perhaps I don't have the time to experiment as much, as the projects are quite specific. You have to design this which will serve these purposes in my workday, I mean. So, but when you're young and were a student like I was, it was much easier to go around and discover the world. And I'm sure you see it as well, the university answers with people, they go out and wild, because these are things that sometimes you only do in university. Real life, it's a bit different with everything that it includes.
But to add more on that, I don't know if Jérôme wants to come in, but going back to what I was saying earlier about technology is giving us that space to do it. I've seen a lot of designers that they're disabled designers, and they might be dyslexic, they might be colorblind, but then they're engaging more than design process. And I think that if it's a message to come out from this webinar in a particular, it will be that we have to give the space to those people that that they are aware of, either for personal experience or circumstances, or of other people they might know, or the environment they grow up, or the knowledge they may have, to bring this knowledge to the design, because I think that design will only get better when we are able to include more people and be more diverse.
Yeah, I agree.
kind of a good conclusion because I cannot see any further question. I wanted to comment and also explain the topic of this webinar was also in link with the awards because we have the design for good category and the project you shared, Anastasios touch the art at Prado is really interesting, and I've seen that we start to receive project like this in this category. So Emilios, you will have the chance to discover some as a jury member. To wrap up also, thank you both. Thanks a lot for this really inspiring moment. I invite our audience to follow us on the social media. Don't hesitate to submit projects, especially in this category. We really want to highlight the work of a committed designer that want to change the world, that want to make the world more inclusive, more diverse, more sustainable. And also, yes, thank you very much to Monotype, our partner, for this webinar and for the awards.
Thanks so much. It's been a pleasure, Jérôme and Anastasios. Thank you for having this talk today. I think it was really nice.
Thanks for the audience as well, and some very, very interesting questions. So thank you.